and the fact that in Barrow Furnace and Faslane we have one of the very centres of excellence globally that will help deliver it. I'm confident that all those statements will turn out to be exactly as they were made. And just to give some indication, we are increasing the number of jobs in Barrow already from 10,000 to 17,000 people in order to fulfil both the Dreadnought programme, the nuclear deterrent, and indeed the next generation of Britain's attack submarines.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I thank my right honourable friend for the considerable effort that his department, the government and the Navy have put into securing this important agreement. It was heartening at the commissioning of HMS Anson to see representatives from the Royal Australian Navy and also the Australian government present, and also the announcement that Australian submariners will be training on that vessel too. With that in mind, would my right honourable friend agree with me that this agreement is absolutely crucial to securing a new geopolitical and strategic agreement with Australia, the US and the UK on areas such as subsea and cyber to keep us safe?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. And look, Barrow Furnace, Devonport and Faslane are key components in delivering our nuclear submarine capability and can almost not be replicated around the world. And it's very, very important we recognise the specialty and the skills. Look, when Australia chose to go for nuclear submarines as an option, it did so because it recognised about 5 countries on Earth can do this, and it is important if it wants to retain a strategic edge in the Pacific and its part of the world against any future adversaries. We know that. That's what we did for the last 70 years in the Atlantic alongside our American friends. Australia, I'm delighted, are joining that programme.
Martin Dockett to use.
Mr. Speaker, the AUKUS deal was supposed to be the defining agreement of the Indo-Pacific tilt that this government said in the integrated review, I'm sure the Secretary of State will remember, was to make the UK the European partner with the broadest and most integrated presence in the Indo-Pacific. Now, given today's news and the combination of historic defence cuts and inflation are going to make the high hopes of the integrated review harder to fulfil this time, I wonder, can the Secretary of State inform the House whether it will still be the UK's aim to be the European partner with the broadest and most integrated presence in the Indo-Pacific?
It's right to ask those questions. It is still our ambition, and so far 2 of the planks are already in place. AUKUS, and we'll see the full details, and it is no mean undertaking to commit to helping build another country, build that capability, and be engaged in its training and deployment. That is a very deep and enduring. The United States investment and joining with us all those decades ago has lasted for 70 years in that. That is a tilt by any means basis. But also we've had Carrier Strike Group on its visit only 2 years ago. That's continued and we plan for another one in 2025.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More broadly, Mr. Speaker, what steps is my right honourable friend's department taking to further strengthen and broaden the AUKUS alliance?
The second pillar of AUKUS includes things such as AI, hypersonics and cyber and all sorts of other technologies that are critically vital not only to complement deployment of submarine but also to further engage our collective security. Those are technologies that rarely are shared between nations, but the United States recognises that in order to face up to the end of this decade and the challenges that we make sure we share together both our industries and their industries, but we have protection for all of us from each other's markets to make sure that we share and then get to sell into them as well, which is quite important.
Says Secretary of State John Beasley.
This week, like the Secretary of State, I'll be meeting the Australian Defence Minister and discussing AUKUS with him. I want him to know that there may be a change of UK government at the next election, but there will be no change in Britain's commitment to AUKUS. If done well, this pact could deepen our closest alliances, it could strengthen security in the Indo-Pacific, and it could bring game-changing investment to Britain. So what priority has the Defence Secretary given to building the first subs here, and when will the build plan be announced?
I'm welcome to the right honourable gentleman's support for AUKUS, and I noted a point on a government. There'll be obviously no complacency from the Labour Party opposite, Mr. Speaker. I hope they wouldn't repeat what happened once in the 1990s. I think the reality is, it makes good security sense. The Labour front bench recognises, this Labour front bench recognises good global security, even though the last one didn't. The questions my right honourable friend, gentleman asked I have to say, are a matter for the Australians. They will make the decisions ultimately. They are ultimately the customer in the sense of where they're going to spend the Australian taxpayers' money. We, of course, have contributed to the discussion and offer, and Australia will have to make a decision about time, how quick it wants its capability. It will have to make a decision about how much it wants to build in Australia, and it will have to make decisions about what's the right fit for its ambition, Britain or the United States' existing fleet. I suspect that will come sometime in March, if not in February. I'm very happy to keep the right honourable gentleman up to date, but we have put in a good proposition, and our relationships, and I'm delighted he is meeting his counterpart, matter.
Number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
The Minister of Defence, as the UK's biggest landowner, is delighted to welcome a range of people to use the land, including walkers, mountain bikers, riders, and as long as they use the land responsibly, welcome on the land. No one, however, should receive special treatment.
Dale Zack.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was a memorandum of understanding that facilitated the monitoring of trail hunting on his department's land. Now, sadly, trail hunting is sometimes used as a smokescreen for illegal hunting, and the Defence Infrastructure Organisation has recorded incidents of foxes killed on Ministry of Defence land and the threatening conduct of some hunt staff. So could the Secretary of State tell us whether he was aware of the serious concerns in the DIO over the behaviour of hunts licensed in his name, and what advice was given by officials?
First of all, I'm glad the honourable members raised the MOU. The MOU was put in place without any announcement to Parliament, any informing of members of this House, without even putting it in the library, as normally would be for a change of policy by any government. Now, that was obviously disturbing to then discover this policy existed and gave special treatment to one group of users. Now, I'm sure he doesn't want people to have special treatment. I think everyone has a right to use that land that way. It also coincided with a large donation to the Labour Party at the turn of the century from a whole group of those animal rights people. It's corrupt, Mr. Speaker. That's what that is, corrupt. A policy unannounced to this House after a funding donation to one political party, and now they're asking for special treatment. Everyone should respect each other on how they use that land. What I am aware of, having now investigated even further, is there are plenty of complaints from other sides, and this is not about size, this is about whether one group gets special treatment.
That's it, Grady.
We must revisit this, don't we?
Yeah.
None.
I understand.
Right,
Speaker, well, in that case, I don't expect the government. In that case, I don't expect the MOD will be taking any credit for the work that the Conflict Stability and Security Fund does. The reality is that over the years, the government has made a habit of double counting spending to both the ODA target and the NATO 2% defence target. And of course, the Home Office is busy raiding the ODA budget at every chance it gets. Doesn't that do a disservice to what both the NATO 2% target and the ODA target are supposed to achieve?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the connection to the NATO target is somewhat tenuous, but there is a pattern to the honourable gentleman's questions. I think this is the 4th time he's asked this question in orals, as well as a number of written questions. I think his point is principally aimed at Foreign Office colleagues and the Treasury. But if he would like to meet with MOD officials to discuss once and for all the MOD's plans for the uses of ODA, I'd be very happy to facilitate such a meeting.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of budgets and Ukraine, could I invite the Minister to respond to comments from the United States, our closest security ally, which tally with the Defence Committee's own findings that this conflict in Ukraine has exposed serious shortfalls in the warfighting capability of the British Army. This is not about the professionalism of individuals, units or formations, but about the overall combat strength and the equipment they use, as well as the ability to meet increasing demands caused by the deteriorating threat picture.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure the United States has said anything about the overseas development assistance budget recently, but I think if you'll indulge, Mr. Speaker, there's a sort of wider point of news. Thank you. I think everybody's clear. The Secretary of State has said many times, as have I and other ministerial colleagues, that serial underinvestment in the Army over decades has led to the point where the Army is in urgent need of recapitalisation. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister get that, and there's a budget coming.
Stephen Hammond.
5, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the National Shipbuilding Strategy and the National Shipbuilding Office is supporting our ambition to grow the UK shipbuilding enterprise and support UK jobs. 5 new Type 31 frigates are being built in Rosyth will support more than 1,000 UK jobs. The Fleet Solid Support contract will deliver £77 million of investment and create more than 1,200 jobs in the UK shipyards and many more across the UK supply chain.
I think it's grouped, Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I was informed it had been withdrawn or not. Sorry. With permission, could I group it with number 8? Sorry. Thank you.
Don't worry. That's great, Stephen Hammond.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for that encouraging answer? He will know that offshore support vessels will be required for the Crown Estate offshore wind leasing arrangements, which is due to be tendered. Can he say whether he could do anything to ensure those vessels are made in the UK?
First of all, obviously, those vessels are predominantly a matter for private companies or indeed non-government departments to choose how and why to buy. But of course, in order to try and encourage more UK shipbuilding, we obviously announced last year in the shipbuilding strategy the Home Shipbuilding Credit Guarantee Scheme, which is there to help counter the perverse incentive that it seems to be that other countries' export credits encourage British companies to build abroad, and obviously been working very closely with BEIS on this, and hopefully we'll announce more details soon.
Well, Blackman.
Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his answer thus far. Clearly, as we replace ageing ships and increase the size of the Navy, it's important that we ensure that those ships are built in Britain rather than being built abroad. So what measures will he take to make sure there's a long-term plan to make sure that our shipbuilders can plan for the future?
Point my honourable friend to the National Shipbuilding Strategy that not only puts in place lots of measures such as, for example, the Home Shipbuilding Guarantee Scheme, export credits for foreign buyers, but also a skills plan, yards for the future plan about what a modern yard should look like in order we can compete with European yards that already beat us in too many contracts, but also a shipbuilding pipeline. Incredibly important to indicate to the industry there is a long-term pipeline to come through, but it is also important to recognise that if we're going to be successful like we are in the aerospace industry, we'll need to export. And if we're going to export to other markets, we have to recognise that international collaboration is also part of the process. Do I think Australia and Canada would have bought our Type 26s if we said, no way, you're only having British on it? The answer would have been no, and we'd have all suffered in our supply chain as a result.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding what the Secretary of State has said there, we know that there are many aspects of the British shipbuilding industry that does feel that our government has been less supportive of them than some of our competitor nations around the world. And if the government continues to award contracts where large proportions of the work are completed abroad, won't this undermine the British shipbuilding industry? And won't the Secretary of State say something more about how we can ensure more of these ships are actually built within UK shipbuilding firms?
Mr. Speaker, I really urge the honourable gentleman not to listen to the propaganda claptrapted by the union leadership. I went to Belfast recently and met the local unions. I met to Appledore and met the local unions. You know what? They don't agree with their leadership statements and rather bizarre propaganda. Fundamentally, the future solid support ship will be entirely put together and 2/3 of it nearly built or supplied through the UK at the same time as getting £77 million of investment in the yards to modernise the yards in order that our yards compete. For too long, our yards have not won contracts, whether from government or private, because we haven't found that the big prime contractors invested in modernising the skills in the yards. And when I meet the workforce, whether it's in government or whatever, they want to be invested in.
We've got to get through all the questions, not just this first one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll refer the House to my register of interest. Mr. Speaker, as a proud member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I've been lucky enough to visit some of our NATO parliamentary countries, like the US and Spain, who take huge pride in their buoyant shipbuilding sector. The Secretary of State talked about the ships being put together in the country. Can the Minister tell us, with contracts being awarded outside, with large portion of it being completed abroad, how does he expect to keep investment in the UK?
I'm sorry, it's not fair to everybody else. I'm bringing you in on supplementary. It doesn't mean you can take all day. Try and answer it, please.
I can guess the memo that was sent from the union to the honourable lady about what to ask. I mean, the reality is, Mr. Speaker, is what I can say is unless we invest in our shipbuilding industry, unless we collaborate internationally, we won't have a shipbuilding industry. We tried it the other way, it didn't work. We have to build collaboratively. And you know what? In the aerospace industry, like in Lancashire, where Mr. Speaker, are from, The Typhoon aircraft is, of course, an international collaboration, and it's a world-beating success, employing tens of thousands of British people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In an answer to a written parliamentary question to me on the 26th of January 2023, the Minister for Defence Procurement said that the Type 32 frigates are a key part of the future fleet. In the National Audit Office report on the equipment plan, the NAO reported that Navy Command withdrew its plans for the Type 32 frigates because of concerns about unaffordability. How can Type 32 frigates be a key part of the future fleet if there are question marks around its affordability?
Well, that's because the Type 32 frigate, when it comes in, wouldn't be till after 2030 or 2031, because it's going to come after the Type 31s, which are obviously being constructed as we speak in Rosyth. What they are going to be, how they're going to be designed and who built them is obviously a matter between now and towards the centre of the decade. It's also important because even if he gets into government, no Treasury will give you a budget for another 7 years forward to make sure that we don't sign on the dotted line before we have the budget in line. But it is absolutely the intention of the Royal Navy to have more frigates and destroyers, including the Type 32.
Number 6, sir.
Defence procurement is some of the most complex in government, but our defence and security industrial strategy represents a step change that will see industry, government and academia working closer together, while fundamentally reforming regulations to improve the speed of acquisition and incentives, innovation and productivity. Our acquisition reforms will drive pace and agility into procurement to improve delivery.
David. I very much tell the Secretary of State I very much agree with him on the need for increased defence expenditure if we are to remain a Tier 1 power. Nevertheless, in every one of the last 25 years, the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee have criticised the MOD's procurement of equipment. Poor identification of military needs, poor quality of equipment, slow delivery of projects, an inability to control costs, and a corporate culture too traditional and resistant to change are just some of the criticisms. Does he agree with me that we need to put these issues right if we are to be a Tier 1 power?
I absolutely agree. I also, first of all, it's why I think for the second or nearly third year in a row, under my stewardship, the Ministry of Defence is going to come in on budget or under budget for the first time in decades to make sure that we live within our means. But secondly, I think it's also important to point out, and it is always a challenge for any Secretary of State Defence, that treasuries like to deal in 1, 2, 3 or 4 years. Some of the programmes we're talking about, the Type 31, for example, earlier, Future Solid Support Ship, are decades long. And in that long process of complexity, threat changes, technology changes, inflation changes, and indeed all the challenges are around. And that's important whether we're going to have governments that invest in long-term infrastructure, whether it's civil or military, to understand that long-term investments is a different risk profile, and that if we do everything year by year, we'll always end up in a similar position.
Thank you. The Secretary of State will be aware that there are growing concerns about the impact of delays and the management of defence programmes on our defence readiness. So what specifically is he doing to ensure that the UK will meet our UK NATO obligations in full?
Good question.
Well, we're still on track and maintain above 2% of GDP, if that's the obligation the Honourable Lady is referring to, of defence spending, and we're still on trajectory to do that. It is, of course, important, as my honourable colleagues point out across the House, to make sure we get good value for money, and it is also important we try and deliver on time. Some programmes are on time. 85% of defence programmes do actually come on time. The major collaborative ones or the major complex ones over long terms are often the ones that cause us problems. We do need to improve that. We need to make sure we don't overspec, Mr. Speaker. We need to make sure that also, where possible, we collaborate and indeed improve internal mechanisms that often hold up things.
The UK has some of the highest defence procurement standards in the world, and I'm glad the government is seeking to drive those standards still further under my right honourable friend's leadership. In cooperating with our international friends and allies and partners, in particular Ukraine, does the Defence Secretary agree with me? It's absolutely vital that those partners have similar levels of transparency in their defence procurement in order to keep public confidence for support for Ukraine.
Yes. It's very important that not only is actually across the international community that the donations we're all making, the public get a sense of where they're going and how they're being used. And it was important on a recent visit I met with Ukrainians, indeed other international partners, to make sure we put in place some form of assurance so that what we're sending, we know where it is going, because I think soon our public will quite rightly say what's happening to it. But it's also important that we recognise what Ukraine has showed us is that supply chains, whether they're domestic or multinational, have to be supported in order to make sure that at times of need we're able to surge them rather than blowing the dust off and taking months or years to reopen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has indicated Ukraine has made graphically clear that long-term ordering is absolutely vital to the defence industry and to maintain capacity, both machinery and also manpower. So does he accept that the failure to place orders for new submarines, nuclear submarines, between 2010 and 2016, even though there was a clear majority for that in this House, was a major strategic error?
I'm very grateful to my honourable gentleman, because if he, I'll do a deal with him. I often try and do a deal with my right honourable gentleman opposite. If he admits too that there were not the only example of that. We have all made strategic errors in our defence policies over the last 2 decades because we've had treasuries that have done short term. We have hollowed out as company. Governments after government have wanted more but not wanted to fund it. His government was no different. I was serving in the army under his government. I know exactly what it was like.
Well, Francois.
Sir, the Ajax programme has been so controversial that the Secretary of State personally commissioned an independent review by Clive Sheldon QC into the flow of information surrounding it. Has the Secretary of State yet received Mr. Sheldon's report? When does he intend to publish it? And can he promise the House he will do so in full and unredacted?
First of all, I'm informed by my right honourable friend, the Minister of Defence Procurement, that it's coming imminently, and imminently I hope that means a few weeks, not months. I will read it, and then, of course, I will make sure, certainly, at the very least, the findings are shared with the House, but I'm very happy to have a discussion with the Defence Select Committee about how much we can share with it, subject to if there are any security concerns. The good news is the Ajax is now starting its next phase of its trials. As I've always said to this House, I am determined to fix this troubled programme. We are now on the way to getting through its next most important trials, having passed its user viability trials up until Christmas. So I'm going to try and fix that programme, get it delivered, and at the same time I'm delighted to learn the lessons.
And Jarvis.
Mr. Speaker, the MOD procures services to administer defence housing and accommodation. It's now over a month since my urgent question, when the Minister said Vivo, Amy and Pinnacle are, I know, in no doubt about the Minister's profound dissatisfaction at their performance. But since then, there have been more cases of poor repair and poor service. So can the the Secretary of State say, specifically with regard to defence accommodation, is the procurement process fit for purpose? And does he have confidence in the current providers?
Well, it's a timely question by the honourable gentleman. This weekend I looked at the different options about whether we can find either compensation or recompense from the providers in the first place, and I get a weekly update on each individual cases, how many cases are in the queues. In some areas they have made progress, in some areas their progress is comparable or better than the private sector. There is still work to be done on it. I'm most concerned about mould and dampness being opening. In areas around heating we have seen some success, but we do expect a better service. My honourable friend, the Minister of Defence Procurement, is regularly meeting with them, but it is also important to note that we will keep even their contracts under review, and if we don't get a better standard, then there are other steps I will take.
Minister Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question from my colleague from Barnsley Central is a good one, because the government's failure on defence procurement isn't limited just to weapons and ammunition. You only need to speak to those people in defence housing with leaky roofs, black mould and broken boilers to realise that defence procurement is failing the people who serve our military and their families. The MOD last year paid £144 million to private contractors to maintain these service families' accommodations, yet many of these homes are still waiting repairs, not getting the service that they deserve. So as one of his ministers has admitted, these contracts do not represent value for taxpayers' money. Why did the MOD sign these contracts in the first place? And when will he be able to tell all our troops that they have a home fit for heroes?
But we always want our homes to be fit for the men and women of our armed forces, and I distinctly remember my time in Germany and indeed in the UK living under a standard of home when it was done in-house. and I can assure you there were issues then, if not in some cases worse. What we have been monitoring, however, is making sure we get these reports answered. It was interesting that the start point of some of these problems was the lack of manning of the very beginning, the helpline, when people were ringing up at Christmas, there was almost no one there, and then working through this whole process. Look, we are trying to do more about it. We will hold them to account. We will take financial action against them or whatever if we have to, and I'm not shy about doing it. We will try and seek compensation for those people suffering and improve what's happening. But we are also seeing in some areas that waits over 5 days are getting better, and that's the first point, and then we're getting clearer.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Multiple major procurement projects for which the Submarine Delivery Agency is responsible for are late or over budget, or often both. Taxpayers are used to the concept of bonuses, but in the real world these bonuses are linked to performance. And those same taxpayers are hemorrhaging billions of their hard-earned taxes on the demonstrable failures of the MOD, not the least of which is within the SDA. So how can the Secretary of State justify six-figure bonuses to executives of failing MOD agencies? And on the eminently reasonable supposition that he can't defend the indefensible, what will he do to rectify those incoherent remuneration packages going forward?
What the payments represent is that we have made a number of new appointments and are turning around the Submarine Development Agency to improve the availability. One of the areas of deep concern has been the consequences of hollowing out over the decades, has been about the maintenance and the availability of dry docks and others and things like Devonport that allow us to turn submarines round to make sure they are maintained in time to get them to better availability. It's important, it is going well, it is important, Mr Speaker, to sometimes change the workforce and make sure you get the best capable people you can to change it around. I'm confident that the new team is able to do that, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results.
Question 7, Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I'll answer numbers 7 and 17 together. Mr Speaker, on Thursday I had the very great pleasure of visiting Lancashire. In particular, Veterans UK at Norcross, where I met some really great people providing a range of support to our veterans. One of the biggest impediments to progress is around data. Consequently, we are putting 40 million into a transformation programme which will digitise our existing processes, enabling our staff to provide more effective and efficient support to our personnel and veterans, and substantially improving their experience.
Robin Miller.
Mr Speaker, our veterans and their families have made an invaluable contribution to securing our freedoms and our nation, but broadly only about a quarter of them are in receipt of a pension which entitles them to support from the Veterans Advisory Pensions Committees across the UK. Will the Minister join me first in paying tribute to the work of VAPCs in supporting veterans, and secondly, will he support my private member's bill on February the 24th, which seeks to extend their remit and expand the cohort of veterans to whom they can offer assistance?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. VAPCs provide a wonderful and unsung service, as did the war pension committees before them. And of course, I look forward to the 24th of February and will give his bill my wholehearted support.
Murray Rimmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Those prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to keep our country safe should not have to rely on benefits to get by. How does the Minister plan on helping veterans reliant on universal credit acquire the skills they need to access well-paid employment?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady. She'll be aware of the Career Transition Partnership. She will be aware too of the special arrangements that exist for those veterans who are unfortunately ill or injured to get them into civilian life in a seamless way and provide them with the skills that they need for the rest of their lives. It's important to understand that all servicemen and all servicewomen are civilians in waiting. They all return to the communities from which they're drawn. And throughout their careers, they will have preparation to enable them to do so in as seamless fashion as possible with the skills that they need.
James Sunderland.
Mr Speaker, thank you. The Minister will know that the Veterans All-Party Group are currently running a survey into the experience of veterans across the UK when claiming compensation, war pensions and other fiscal support for Veterans UK. That survey closes tomorrow, so will he please agree to meet me to discuss the findings of that survey, and depending on what they say, does he agree in principle to any measures which better assure the outputs of Veterans UK?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable and gallant friend for his chairmanship of the Veterans All-Party Parliamentary Group and for the survey that he has undertaken. I am very much looking forward to the results of that survey. He'll be aware that MOD, of course, itself does a variety of surveys and canvassing to ensure that we are giving our serving personnel, our veterans and their families, what they need to pursue their careers and their lived experience that is positive. But I'm very much looking forward to what his group has to say, and of course I'll meet with him.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. The Minister will know and appreciate that mental ill health affects disproportionately veterans and their families. The cost of living crisis is putting even more pressure on access to mental health services, according to veterans' charities. The Labour Party has committed to a £35 million investment in veterans' mental health. I ask this sincerely of the Minister. Will he match that?
Well, firstly, I have to correct the honourable gentleman. He's not right to say that veterans, or indeed defence personnel, are more likely than the general public to suffer from mental health problems. The reverse is the case. However, it is absolutely essential we do all in our power to promote the mental health of our men and women. Absolutely right. And he will be aware of a number of projects, including Op Courage, and throughout people's careers in which their mental health is promoted. And we will continue to do that. But he does need to understand that defence is a positive experience for the vast majority of people who experience it.
Shadow Minister Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The initial headline findings of the independent review of the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme state that the process is overly burdensome and even distressing for the claimant due to unreasonable timeframes and a lack of transparency. This is but one of a number of concerns raised about the compensation scheme, all of which veterans across the country have been telling us about for a very long time. Veterans who have made huge sacrifices to keep our country safe deserve far better from this government. So can the Minister tell the House when the full report will be published and what he's doing to ensure its findings will be acted upon swiftly?
Well, the Honourable Lady is referring to the quinquennial review, which has published its interim findings and will publish its definitive report in the spring. She's right to highlight some of the findings of that report in its interim form, and of course we'll take into account all of those, well, if the Honourable Lady will allow me, in the spring when the report is published. One of those things, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that the system is less adversarial than it previously has been, but we have to understand that a lot of the delay is baked in because of the need to obtain proper, full, comprehensive medical reports.
Sir Robert Lee.
Number 10, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Type 32 programme began the concept phase on the 21st of September 2022 and will seek to deliver an outlined business case in spring 2024. The programme and procurement strategy will be decided following the concept phase in the normal way.
But
further to the exchange between the Secretary of State and the Shadow Minister earlier this afternoon, can the Minister confirm that, whilst I understand that this Type 32, so-called, won't come on stream till 2030, the government is fully committed to having an ongoing warship programme? It doesn't matter whether we call it the 31A or 32 or whatever. We remain committed to renewing the Royal Navy's capability after 2030.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, and last week I had the pleasure of being in Rosyth, where we were cutting steel, or steel was being cut in respect of Type 31, and that is an affordable frigate which is able to be configured for the mission, so whether that's a humanitarian mission, a war-fighting mission, or anti-piracy mission. That is exactly what we want our frigates to be, flexible, and we want them to ensure that there's a pipeline into the future.
Mr. Speaker, the UK, our allies and partners are responding decisively to provide military and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. The UK has led the world with the gifting of modern main battle tanks to Ukraine and are engaging international partners through a coordinated military and diplomatic effort. The Secretary of State for Defence, my honourable friend, should take some personal credit for this, as at every turn throughout the last year it has been him that has sought to understand what the Ukrainians need next and has rallied support across Europe and beyond in that gifting.
Can
I thank my honourable friend for his answer, and can I concur with him that we have shown the way on Ukraine? We've consistently been at the forefront. And he mentioned battle tanks, and it was our announcement that set the precedent that let our allies make their announcements last week. In the same vein, could my honourable friend confirm that we will continue to lead the way on support for Ukraine by pushing our allies to match our commitment that we will send as much military aid to Ukraine this year or more than we did last year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government has already committed the same amount of money for this year as it did for last, so in that sense the job is already done. But of course, how the money this year is used will depend very much on what's going on the ground. And that's the most important part of this gifting programme. The relationship between the UK and Ukraine is now so strong that we're able to discuss very candidly each other's plans and to make sure that we're supporting them every step of the way.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, we heard before Christmas that the government had finally signed a contract to replenish NLAWs, but in order to ensure that we can continue to be a leader in the international effort in Ukraine, how many other contracts have been signed to replace the consumable military aid which has been sent to Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, high-velocity missiles have already been placed on contract, and other systems that have been donated, many of them were already in the process of being updated, and they were gifted coming to the end of their life within our current inventory, and thus they wouldn't be expected to be placed on contract because they're part of a routine procurement process.
SNP spokesperson Dave Doogan.
Mr. Speaker, much of the international support going to Ukraine will be deployed to defend Ukrainians against the barbarity of the private militia, the Wagner Group. So can the Minister explain to the UK's allies why the UK government made available frozen assets of Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, in order that he could take a case out against a British journalist? And given this inexplicable accommodation, can the Minister confirm, does this Tory government roll out the red carpet exclusively for Russian warlords, or is this an inclusive UK service available to war criminals everywhere?
Mr. Speaker, the presence of Wagner on the front line in the Donbass is clearly a reflection of just how bad things have got for Putin and the Russian armed forces, that a mercenary group recruiting from prisons is required. As to the substantive part of the honourable gentleman's questions, sounds like it might be a question for my Treasury colleagues, and I'll make sure that they write to him with an answer.
Smith.
Number 12, please, sir.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to answer number 12 together with 18 and 20. The Ministry of Defence works closely with British industry and academia, including SMEs, to identify and invest in innovative technologies that address our most pressing capability challenges, as well as publishing our future priorities to incentivise investment. We are already testing and deploying those technologies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The best innovation isn't necessarily the preserve of the giant players in the sector, but smaller enterprises such as those found at the Westcott Venture Park in my constituency, like Flarebright's development of autonomous drones for flight in GNSS-denied areas. So can my honourable friend assure me that these smaller, dynamic enterprises are as valued to his department when it comes to developing new defence innovations as the more traditional big beasts?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. A lot of the innovation does indeed come from those agile SMEs, and that's why the MOD's SME Action Plan is very firmly aimed at improving access for SMEs to work right through the defence supply chain. The MOD indeed has a target that 25% of its procurement spend will go directly and indirectly to SMEs, which is up from around 16% in 2016. Latest figures I've seen, we're at 23% already. We're on the right path, further to go.
Davies.
The Tempest fighter jet and the Challenger 3 tank are examples of this government's commitment to giving our forces good quality equipment. But does my honourable friend agree that we must also prioritise the well-being of our personnel? And one of the ways we can do this is to ensure that the quality of their food matches the calibre of their kit.
Very grateful to my honourable friend. He is, of course, absolutely right. Ensuring that our service personnel receive good quality meals is a vital contribution to defence capability. And that's why the Ministry of Defence has established a team of subject matter experts to overhaul and modernise defence catering delivery, using the findings of the Delivering Defence Dining Quality Review and the ongoing Army Eats trials to inform change to the total food offer. The trials began in 2020. The results are expected imminently, and that will inform the future of dining for defence.
Well, come on, Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we want to keep our country safe, we need to work with our allies to make sure that we remain at the forefront of the latest developments in defence technology. Can my right honourable friend therefore confirm that our partnership with Japan, or our new partnership with Japan and Italy, will involve collaborating
on areas such as weapons and UAVs and not just on fighter jets?
To my honourable gentleman. So the ambition of this truly international programme is principally to deliver a cutting-edge fighter aircraft providing a credible deterrent to future threats. But, as he knows, this is a system of systems, and it's likely to include uncrewed aircraft, new sensors, weapons, advanced data systems and secure networks. And those wider capabilities may be developed together with wider partners or indeed together with our existing partners in that endeavour. We will continue to explore system opportunities both between our core partnership and more widely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the recent Memorandum of Understanding signed by the RAF in Imperial College London, how do ministers expect this will impact the RAF's technological capabilities, particularly around digital and artificial intelligence?
Well, of course, digital and artificial intelligence are absolutely central to RAF capability. I was delighted to announce recently significant investment that is taking place in Lincolnshire to ensure that when those aircraft take to the skies, they have all the weapons system, but also the battlefield management plans that they require to ensure that they can take the fight to the enemy.
Ford. Number 13, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the National Security Bill contains provisions that will help in prosecuting those who use their knowledge and expertise to train foreign militaries prejudicial to the interests of the UK. In the meantime, while the bill passes through this House and the other House, we've issued guidance to all defence personnel at risk and reminded personnel of their obligation to protect sensitive information. This has led to improved reporting of suspicious activity.
Richard Ford. I thank the Secretary of State for that helpful response. Qualified RAF pilots are quitting for better paid jobs that involve training other countries' air forces. And fixed-wing aircraft have dropped by nearly a quarter since 2017. We learned last week that all of the RAF's Hawkjet trainer aircraft have been grounded because of an engine issue. Given that the government will be in the High Court tomorrow in an effort to justify supplying arms for use in the war in Yemen, what does he have to say to MPs across the House who are concerned about the deployment of RAF personnel to Saudi Arabia in the last couple of months to train the Royal Saudi Air Force?
I have absolutely no problem with supporting our friend and ally in the region, Saudi Arabia. We've done it for decades and will continue to do so.
We come to Topicals, Mary Kelly Foy.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Stay.
Mr. Speaker, colleagues may have read reports this weekend about activity conducted by the Army's counter-disinformation unit in 77 Brigade. Online disinformation from foreign state actors is a serious threat to the United Kingdom, which is why during the pandemic we brought together expertise from acts across government to monitor disinformation about COVID. 77 Brigade is a hybrid unit of regular and reserve personnel that has established in 2015. It delivers information activities as part of broader military effects against hostile state actors and violent extremist organisations based outside the UK. It uses publicly available data, including material shared on social media platforms, to assess UK disinformation trends. It is not to be involved in regulating, policing or even reporting opinion that it may or may not agree with.
Mary Kelly Foy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Daniel was medically discharged from the Army in 2015. Yet in September 2022, Daniel was only awarded Tariff 10 compensation. He is housebound and fully reliant on his mother, and psychiatrists agree that his condition is sadly permanent. 7 years on, and Daniel is still without the compensation that reflects the severity of his mental injury. So will the Minister meet with me to review this case and ensure that veterans who suffer psychological injuries are equally compensated with those who suffer physical injuries?
Hear, hear. I'd be delighted to meet with the Honourable Lady to discuss the case.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been to see some of the RAF housing in Coston recently, and with mould in homes with children present or repairs that have been requested but not completed, it seems that the Pinnacle Vivo partnership is failing military families. What are ministers doing to hold them to account?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. I know Bryce quite well. I know the accommodation that he's referring to. He may be aware that all TLBs are meant to be assessing now their accommodation against the Defence Housing Standard and will report by the end of the year. In the meantime, he should know that 10 billion over the, 1.6 billion over the next 10 years will be invested in barracks accommodation to improve some of the truly awful accommodation that sadly our men and women have to put up with.
Show Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This month the government made important but again ad hoc announcements of more military help for Ukraine.
we're still waiting for the 2023 action plan of support for Ukraine, first promised by the Defence Secretary last August. Will he publish this ahead of the first anniversary of Russia's invasion next month?
Look, I do totally agree with the right honourable gentleman that we need to set out a plan, but can I also tell him, and I've chased it in advance of these questions from the previous question, our donations are not ad hoc. Right? There is a view abroad that somehow these are just ad hoc and the Ukrainians pick up the telephone. Fundamentally, these donations are set by what happens on the ground, by the reaction to the Russian to Ukrainian defence, and how Ukraine needs to adapt. It's not an ad hoc thing, it's a very deliberate process, mainly called by the United Kingdom and her allies, and therefore it's really important to separate that from an overall strategy about announcing to Parliament the different lines of effort that we take to counter Russia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Defence Secretary said the armed forces have faced what he called a consistent hollowing out under Labour and early Conservative governments. But when Labour left government in 2010, Mr. Speaker, the British Army stood at over 100,000 full-time troops, and we were spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. The serious hollowing out has happened since. Who does he think's been in charge over the last 13 years?
You only have to, Mr. Speaker, listen to the veterans on this side to understand their experience under a Labour government. Snatch Land Rovers, let's remember that, and all that awful mess as a result of the Labour government's investment. The deal here is quite simple. If the right honourable gentleman opposite wants to be the next Secretary of Defence, he should come here and get off his chest the shortcomings that his former government did. I'm happy to say that we have hollowed out and underfunded. Will he do the same, or will he hide behind petty party politics?
Butler. Hello.
Speaker, last week I visited His Majesty's Naval Base Clyde with the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme and want to pay tribute to the absolutely remarkable men and women we met there who make up our nation's submarine service. Given that we live in ever more dangerous times, can my right honourable friend confirm to the House that this Conservative government remains absolutely committed to delivery of the new Dreadnought class of submarines to be based in Scotland to provide a continuous at-sea deterrent and so protect our United Kingdom for decades?
So I'm glad that my honourable friend and many other colleagues went to Faslane last week and that they enjoyed their visit. We are, of course, committed to the replacement of Vanguard submarines with Dreadnought, but more importantly, he mentions the brilliant people based at Faslane who deliver day in, day out our nation's nuclear deterrent, unseen under the oceans of the world. They are incredible people doing amazing work.
Norris. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is surely right that non-UK veterans who settle here after their service do not pay visa fees, but it is surely not right that this doesn't extend to their dependents. Will the Minister match our commitment on these benches to change that?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I can't give him the undertaking that he asked for me. I'll understand that. Obviously, all things are kept under review, but we do value the service of those from overseas who serve in His Majesty's Armed Forces, clearly, and I think most of them have a very positive experience.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We ought to be extremely proud of the government's impact. We are the second largest supplier of military equipment to the Ukrainians in the entire world, only second to the United States of America. Today we have our troops training the Ukrainian troops on how to use the Challenger 2 tanks. Can I ask the Minister when those will be deployed onto the battlefield so we can start to see a serious impact in bringing this heinous war to an end?
Well, obviously, for security reasons, my honourable friend, I can't tell my honourable friend exactly the timings. What I can say is it starts with training on the individual operation of the platforms, then on training on being able to join together with formation units to fight as a formed unit, because that's important, and then from then those tanks will be put in. What I can say is it'll be this side of the summer, or May, it'll be probably towards Easter time.
Mike Ainsley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 45% of Cheshire military personnel are living in the lowest standard of single accommodation. That's 220. That's pretty shameful. And something needs to happen about it quite urgently. How does the Minister ensure that they have homes genuinely fit for heroes?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. 97% of MOD service family accommodation meets or exceeds the government housing standard. However, that's better than most local authorities and better than most registered social landlords. And he may be interested to know, because I looked it up earlier, that 105 homes in his Labour-controlled local authority that are owned by that local authority are below the decent home standards, and I suggest he takes it up with his council.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will join me in thanking the wonderful team at the Defence National Rehabilitation Centre, which is based in Rushcliffe, for the amazing work they do treating injured members of our armed forces. Can I ask the Minister what assessment he's made of how the expertise and the cutting-edge technology at that centre could be shared with our Ukrainian allies to help rehabilitate Ukrainian heroes who are injured on the front line?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. As it happens, last Monday I visited the Defence Medical Rehabilitation Centre. I also heard about the NHS-led National Rehabilitation Centre that hopefully will be stood up by the end of next year, and together they will be able to provide a truly trailblazing international centre for rehabilitation and for research. Obviously, this country stands by to help Ukraine in their fight against Putin in any way possible, including in the rehabilitation of its brave men who have given so much, not only in the defence of Ukraine, but also in defence of the rest of us.
Mr. Speaker, Labour's dossier of the waste in the MOD found that at least 15 billion has been wasted in taxpayers' money since 2010. Can the Minister explain why the government is failing to get a grip of the defence procurement process to secure value for money for the taxpayer?
It's a really wonderful dossier as far as dodgy ones go, because half the waste was under Labour government in it.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Speaker, will the Secretary of State join with me in applauding Poland's historic announcement today that it's raising its defence budget to 4% of GDP? And can he imagine what conclusion I think our government ought to draw from that example?
My right honourable friend always tempts me. I think the Poles who are on the front line and have shown tremendous leadership in the face of Russia's growing aggression, not only to itself but also to its neighbours and friends in Ukraine. I think the conclusion they have drawn is the world is a dangerous, unstable place, and it's not likely to get less so anytime soon.
Dan Carden.
Mr. Speaker, the call for evidence for the LGBT Veterans Independent Review revealed that the police records of veterans convicted during the ban on homosexuality were destroyed. Now, in answers to parliamentary questions, the Department says this was in line with data protection, but in letters to veterans, it says this decision was taken by Defence Police Chiefs Council, who directed that all investigations into offences relating solely to sexuality were to be removed from our systems and deleted from the records. Can the Secretary of State or Ministers write to me to clarify this, and will they consider making the Council meetings with the Defence Police Chiefs public?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising this. Between 1967 and 2000, there's no question that people in the LGBT community were badly dealt with by Defence, and that's why we've set up the Etherton Review, which will report shortly. And I can tell you, having met with Lord Etherton, that he will be forensic in his examination of the data. I think I can assure the honourable gentleman, however, that the handling of records, as far as we can tell, was in accordance with civilian practice. But of course we stand by and wait for his lordship to opine on the matter, and will comment further when he has done so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend set out what preparations his department have made in terms of the support for overseas territories in the Caribbean during this year's hurricane season?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I enjoyed working with my right honourable friend when she was the Minister for the Overseas Territories, and she's right to care about this. She will know that the Department has done a lot of work over the last few years to develop the resilience of the Overseas Territories, as well as maintaining naval assets in the region and more at readiness to assist if required.
Maybe a permanent base in the Ortiz would help. Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During my recent visit to Ukraine with the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green, Ukrainian officials were very clear about their need for increased military support. with the United States reportedly discussing the creation of a fighter jet coalition with Ukraine, and the German Chancellor currently ruling out sending fighter jets to Ukraine, what assessment has the government made regarding building such a coalition with their NATO allies?
Well, having taken the battle on getting tanks into Ukraine, obviously, understandably, people then ask about what next capability. I think what we know about all these demands is that eventually the initial response is no, and it ends up being yes. So we will see, we will track the progress, but as I say, it is not based on ad hoc. It's based on need and defined what's needed on the battlefield. Of course, we will keep our minds open all the time about what is possible to do next.
Then Caroline Downage.
Speaker, I warmly welcome the announcement of £1.6 billion to repair and refurbish on-site base accommodation. As the Minister rightly says, the accommodation in both HMS Sultan and HMS Collingwood is truly awful. Meanwhile, we hear that in the Portsmouth area alone, the Royal Navy are spending millions of pounds a year putting people up in hotels, while Fort Blockhouse, within my Gosport constituency, which he knows very well, remains empty. When are the MOD going to address this?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. I know she knows the Fort Blockhouse intimately, as indeed do I. It's aesthetically charming, but it is beyond reasonable repair in terms of accommodating servicemen and servicewomen are concerned. We're spending money on HMS Collingwood. I hope it will be brought up to spec shortly.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, veteran Samantha O'Neill, a week today will be made homeless from a hostel by City of York Council, who is a signature to the Armed Forces Covenant. What steps can he make to ensure that she and her 3 children are not homeless a week today?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. Obviously, I can't comment on the details which I don't have. If she sends to me, I will certainly look into them. But every local authority that signed up to the Armed Forces Covenant needs to be mindful of its duty to look after servicemen, servicewomen and their families.
The Charity Saluter reported 133 women, a third of their caseload, last year presented to them having suffered a sexual assault. They presented at Defence Community Mental Health Services but subsequently discharged from the military due to having a personality disorder. I wrote to the Minister for further information. None was available. So would the Minister look into the service to make sure that due clinical rigour is applied before people are discharged with a personality disorder?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend and predecessor. I've seen no evidence that people are being misdiagnosed or mismanaged. The matter, of course, is for healthcare professionals, in particular consultant psychiatrists. I can't really interfere with their diagnoses. I've noted her concerns, and I will certainly look into the matter.
Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, would the Secretary of State agree with me that what we've learned from Ukraine, surely, is the future of good defence is going to be in having the latest technology and innovation? Are there any new schemes that we could have that increase the investment in that new technology, and especially partnership with other countries across NATO?
He's absolutely. First of all, the Diana unit within NATO, I'm delighted we jointly share the European headquarters with Estonia, because I felt it was important to partner with a small, innovative country to make sure we get the very best between us. That's one of them. Our R&D budget is £6.6 billion, one of the leaders in government in investing it. But of course, the real lesson, which has always been a problem, is not only is it important to invest in the inventions, it's pulling it through into an actual requirement. That's traditionally where the defence has fallen down. I'm determined to fix that, and that means focusing our R&D where we know there's a need by our armed services.
Thank you, Mr.
Speaker. Many veterans in East Devon tell me they sometimes struggle to adapt from frontline service into jobs available locally. It is a huge change. The scars of service can be challenging. Can my right honourable friend provide an update on the work of the Defence Transition Service, which supports veterans into good, well-paid jobs?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He might be referring to the Career Transition Partnership, which is the partnership that is normally used for people transitioning into civilian life. The DTS is for those who have in some way been injured or have sustained an illness. That is designed to make sure that people have the support they need to adapt to their particular circumstance, ensure they have the best chance possible of getting a decent civilian job after they leave the services, and it's very successful in so doing it, as is the CTP.
Recent news reports detailing 14,500 urgent maintenance appointments at Armed Forces homes being missed are very concerning. So would my right honourable friend reassure me and my constituents in Southend West he is taking every step to ensure all our soldiers can live in good quality homes?
Well, absolutely. It's a top priority, certainly for me, I know for the Secretary of State and for MINDP. What we have to bear in mind is 97% of those houses are above the government housing standards. So they are better than most councils and better than most registered social landlords. But we must do better than we are at the moment, and we're bending ourselves to that task.